What happens when the people closest to you crush your dreams with just a few words? When your own family looks at your passion and calls it a waste of time? This is exactly what happened to Sarah, a 48-year-old woman from Denver, Colorado, who dared to pursue her love for painting, despite everyone around her saying she was too old, too inexperienced, and simply wasting her time. But sometimes, the universe has a way of proving everyone wrong in the most spectacular way possible. Hi, I'm Tina, and I'm here to share stories that touch our hearts and remind us that it's never too late to follow our dreams. Today, I want to tell you about Sarah's incredible journey, a story that will show you why you should never give up on what makes your soul come alive, no matter what anyone says. By the end of this video, you'll understand how one woman's determination turned ridicule into triumph, and how a single painting changed everything. If you've ever been told you're too old to start something new, or if anyone has ever dismissed your dreams, this story is especially for you. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, because I have so many more inspiring stories to share with you. Sarah Martinez had always felt something missing in her life, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. She worked as a nurse at Denver General Hospital, a job she'd held for over 20 years. Every day was the same routine. Wake up at 5:30, grab a quick coffee, drive through the familiar streets to the hospital, and spend 12 hours caring for others. She was good at her job, excellent even, but there was an emptiness inside her that grew larger with each passing year. During her lunch breaks, she would find herself doodling on napkins or the backs of patient charts, creating little flowers, landscapes, or abstract patterns that seemed to flow from her fingers without conscious thought. Her family had never been particularly supportive of creative pursuits. Her husband, Robert, was a practical man who worked in construction and believed that hobbies were fine as long as they didn't interfere with real responsibilities. Her two adult children, Michael and Jennifer, had inherited their father's practical mindset. Michael worked in finance and was always talking about investments and market trends, while Jennifer was a teacher who focused entirely on her career and raising her two young children. They were a close family in many ways, gathering for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. But there was an unspoken understanding that dreams were luxuries they couldn't afford to indulge. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening in March. Sarah had stopped by an art supply store after her shift, something she'd never done before. She wasn't even sure what drew her inside. Maybe it was the colorful display in the window, or perhaps it was the warm light that seemed to invite her in from the cold, wet street. As she wandered through the aisles, touching canvases and examining brushes, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: excitement. Pure, childlike excitement that made her heart race and her hands shake slightly. She picked up a beginner's acrylic paint set, some brushes, and a small canvas. The total came to $67, money she knew they could afford, but money that felt somehow forbidden. When she arrived home, Robert was already at the kitchen table, going through bills and looking frustrated. "Where have you been?" he asked without looking up. "Your shift ended 2 hours ago." Sarah hesitated, then pulled the art supplies from the bag. "I stopped by an art store," she said, trying to keep her voice casual. "I thought I might try painting." Robert looked up then, his expression shifting from annoyance to something that looked almost like amusement. "Painting? Sarah, you're almost 50 years old. Don't you think it's a little late to start pretending you're some kind of artist?" His words hit her like a physical blow, but she tried to remain calm. "It's just a hobby, Robert. Something to do in my free time." That weekend, Michael and Jennifer came over for their usual Sunday dinner. Sarah had set up a small workspace in the spare bedroom and had started working on her first painting, a simple landscape of the mountains she could see from their back window. She was proud of what she'd accomplished, even though she knew it was amateur work. There was something about mixing the colors, about watching the paint spread across the canvas, that felt like coming home to herself. When Jennifer went upstairs to check on something, she discovered Sarah's little art corner. "Mom, what's all this?" she called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. Soon the whole family was crowded into the spare room, staring at Sarah's easel and her half-finished painting. "Well, this is unexpected," Michael said, his tone carrying the same dismissive quality as his father's. "Mom, you know art supplies are expensive, right? And classes cost money too. Wouldn't this money be better spent on practical things?" Jennifer nodded in agreement. "Michael's right, Mom. Plus, you're so busy with work and taking care of Dad and helping with the grandkids. When would you even have time for this?" Robert crossed his arms and shook his head. "I told her the same thing, but she seems to think she's going to become the next Picasso or something." The laughter that followed felt cruel, even though Sarah knew they probably didn't mean it that way. They were just being practical, just looking out for her, just trying to keep her grounded in reality. But their words felt like tiny daggers, each one puncturing a dream she was only just beginning to acknowledge. That night, after everyone had gone home, Sarah sat in the spare room staring at her unfinished painting. Part of her wanted to pack everything away, to return the supplies and forget this foolish notion that she could be an artist. But another part of her, a stronger part that surprised her with its intensity, refused to give up. She picked up her brush and continued painting, losing herself in the rhythm of color and light until the early hours of the morning. The following weeks were difficult for Sarah as she struggled with her family's reaction to her newfound passion. Every time she pulled out her paints or mentioned anything related to art, she could see the eye rolls and hear the barely concealed sighs. Robert would make comments about wasting money on nonsense whenever he saw her working on a painting, and her children would change the subject whenever she tried to share her excitement about a technique she'd learned or a piece she was working on. The message was clear. Her family thought her artistic pursuits were foolish, impractical, and embarrassing. Despite their lack of support, Sarah couldn't bring herself to stop. Something deep inside her had awakened, something that had been sleeping for decades, and she found that painting was the only thing that made her feel truly alive. She started waking up an hour earlier each morning to paint before work, and she would spend her evenings in the spare room, losing herself in color and texture and the meditative rhythm of brushstrokes on canvas. She painted landscapes, still lifes, abstract pieces that seemed to pour out of her soul. Some paintings were terrible, she knew, but others showed a promise. That surprised even her. 3 months into her artistic journey, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She signed up for a weekend art workshop at a local community center, taught by a professional artist named David Chen, who had moved to Denver from San Francisco. She didn't tell her family about the workshop, knowing they would only discourage her further. Instead, she told Robert she was working an extra shift at the hospital and asked Jennifer to cover for her if anyone called. The lie felt uncomfortable, but she knew it was necessary to protect this fragile new part of herself. The workshop was everything Sarah had hoped it would be, and more. David Chen was a patient, encouraging teacher who saw potential in every student, regardless of their skill level. For the first time since she'd started painting, Sarah was surrounded by people who understood her passion, who spoke her language, who didn't think she was crazy for wanting to create beauty in the world. During the lunch break, David pulled her aside and examined the small canvas she'd been working on. A portrait of an elderly patient she'd cared for at the hospital, painted from memory with remarkable emotional depth. "Sarah," David said, his voice serious, "how long have you been painting?" When she told him it had only been 3 months, his eyes widened in surprise. "This is extraordinary work for someone so new to the medium. You have a natural understanding of light and shadow, and more importantly, you're painting with your heart. That's something that can't be taught." His words sent a thrill through Sarah that she hadn't felt since she was a young girl being praised by a teacher. "I'm going to give you the contact information for my friend Maria Santos. She runs a gallery here in Denver, and she's always looking for new artists. I think you should show her your work." That evening, Sarah returned home with David Chen's business card and Maria Santos's contact information burning a hole in her pocket. She felt like she was carrying a secret that could change her entire life, but she had no one to share it with. At dinner, Robert asked about her extra shift at the hospital, and Sarah found herself making up stories about difficult patients and hectic schedules. The lies felt heavier with each word, but the alternative, facing their mockery and discouragement, felt even worse. Over the next several weeks, Sarah worked with an intensity and focus she'd never experienced before. She created painting after painting, each one better than the last, driven by David Chen's words and the possibility that someone might actually want to see her work in a real gallery. She painted during every free moment she could find, often working by lamplight late into the night, her hands stained with paint and her heart full of a joy she'd never known existed. The night she finally worked up the courage to call Maria Santos was one of the most terrifying and exhilarating of her life. Maria's voice was warm and professional over the phone, and when Sarah explained that David Chen had referred her, Maria immediately became more interested. "David doesn't recommend artists lightly," Maria said. "Why don't you bring 5 of your best pieces to the gallery this Saturday morning? I'd love to take a look at what you're working on." You know, dear friends, sharing Sarah's story with you reminds me why I started this channel in the first place. We all have dreams that others might not understand, passions that seem impractical or foolish to the people around us. But sometimes, the most beautiful things in life come from having the courage to pursue what sets our souls on fire, even when no one else believes in us. If Sarah's story is touching your heart the way it's touching mine, I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. And please, tell me in the comments below, have you ever had a dream that others told you was impossible? I read every single comment, and your stories inspire the videos I create for all of us here in this wonderful community we're building together. Saturday morning arrived with a mixture of terror and anticipation that Sarah had never experienced before. She had carefully selected her 5 best paintings: the portrait of the elderly patient, a landscape of the Rocky Mountains at sunset, an abstract piece inspired by the emotions she felt during particularly difficult shifts at the hospital, a still life of her grandmother's china that somehow captured 30 years of family dinners, and a street scene from downtown Denver that she had painted from a photograph she'd taken on her lunch break. Each painting represented a different aspect of her newfound artistic voice, and together they told the story of a woman discovering herself for the first time in decades. The Santos Gallery was located in the trendy Rhino district of Denver, nestled between a coffee roastery and a vintage clothing boutique. Sarah had driven past this area countless times on her way to work, but she had never stopped to explore it. Now, carrying her paintings in a portfolio case she'd bought specifically for this occasion, she felt like she was entering a different world. The gallery was bright and airy, with white walls that showcased colorful contemporary artwork, and Sarah immediately felt both inspired and intimidated by the professional atmosphere. Maria Santos was a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and paint-stained fingers that immediately put Sarah at ease. She had the kind of presence that suggested years of experience in recognizing talent, and her eyes held a warmth that reminded Sarah of her favorite professor from nursing school decades ago. "You must be Sarah," Maria said, extending her hand with a genuine smile. "David told me wonderful things about your work. I'm excited to see what you've brought me." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened her portfolio case and began setting up her paintings on the easels Maria had provided. With each piece she revealed, she watched Maria's expression carefully, trying to read the professional poker face that gallery owners undoubtedly developed over years of viewing artwork. But as Sarah placed the final painting, the portrait of the elderly patient, on its easel, she saw something shift in Maria's expression. The gallery owner stepped closer, studying the brushwork and the emotional depth that Sarah had somehow managed to capture in the subject's eyes. "Sarah," Maria said quietly, still looking at the portrait, "tell me about your background. Where did you study art? Who were your teachers?" The questions that Sarah had been dreading finally came, and she felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as she admitted that she had no formal training, that she'd only been painting for 4 months, that she was just a nurse who had stumbled into art by accident. She expected Maria to thank her politely and show her to the door, the way she imagined gallery owners dealt with amateur wannabes who wasted their time. Instead, Maria turned to look at Sarah with an expression of amazement. "4 months? You've been painting for 4 months?" When Sarah nodded, Maria shook her head in disbelief. "Sarah, I've been running this gallery for 15 years, and I've seen work from artists with decades of experience that doesn't have half the emotional impact of what you've shown me today. This portrait, in particular, is absolutely extraordinary. You've captured something in this person's eyes that speaks to the human condition in a way that very few artists ever achieve. The conversation that followed felt surreal to Sarah. Maria explained that she was currently planning a group exhibition called Emerging Voices that would feature work from 5 new artists she discovered over the past year. She wanted to include 2 of Sarah's paintings in the show, and if they sold, well, she was interested in discussing the possibility of a solo exhibition in the future. The opening reception was scheduled for 6 weeks away, which would give Sarah time to create a few more pieces if she wanted to expand her representation in the show. Driving home from the gallery, Sarah felt like she was floating several feet above the ground. She had gone from being a complete unknown to having her work selected for a professional gallery exhibition in the span of a single morning. The validation she felt was unlike anything she'd experienced in her adult life. But underneath her excitement was a growing dread about how to share this news with her family. She knew they would find ways to diminish her achievement, to bring her back down to earth with reminders about practicality and responsibility and the foolishness of getting too carried away with artistic fantasies. That evening at dinner, Sarah decided to test the waters by casually mentioning that she'd visited an art gallery that morning. Robert looked up from his meatloaf with a puzzled expression. "What were you doing at an art gallery? Please tell me you weren't spending money on expensive paintings when we're trying to save for the new roof." Jennifer, who had stopped by with her children for dinner, laughed and added, "Mom, you know you can get art at Target for a fraction of the price, right? You don't need to go to fancy galleries." Sarah felt her courage faltering, but something about Maria Santos's words gave her strength. "Actually," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "I wasn't there to buy art. I was there to show my art. The gallery owner wants to include 2 of my paintings in an upcoming exhibition." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert put down his fork and stared at her as if she'd announced she was planning to join the circus. Michael, who had been checking his phone during dinner, finally looked up with an expression that mixed confusion with concern. "Mom," Jennifer said carefully, "are you sure this gallery is legitimate? There are a lot of scams out there that target amateur artists. They make you think your work is valuable, and then they ask you to pay for framing or marketing or exhibition fees." Sarah felt her excitement deflating like a punctured balloon. She tried to explain about David Chen's recommendation and Maria Santos's reputation, but she could see in their faces that they had already decided this was some kind of mistake or delusion on her part. Robert finally spoke, his voice carrying the tone he usually reserved for explaining basic financial concepts to their children when they were young. "Sarah, honey, I think you need to be realistic about this. These gallery people are probably just being nice to you. Art is a business for people who have studied it their whole lives, not something you can just stumble into at 50 years old." The rest of the dinner passed in uncomfortable silence, and Sarah excused herself early to go upstairs to her makeshift studio. As she looked at her paintings, Maria Santos's words echoed in her mind, battling against her family's skepticism. She had 6 weeks to prepare for the exhibition. 6 weeks to prove to herself and everyone else that this wasn't just a middle-aged fantasy, but the beginning of something real and important and life-changing. The 6 weeks leading up to the gallery exhibition became the most intense and transformative period of Sarah's life. Despite her family's continued skepticism, she threw herself into her art with a passion that surprised even her. She woke up at 4 a.m. to paint before her hospital shifts, worked during her lunch breaks on small sketches that would later become full paintings, and spent her evenings lost in the meditative rhythm of brushstrokes and color mixing. Her hands were permanently stained with paint, and she had to start wearing long sleeves to hide the evidence from her coworkers who had begun asking questions about the colorful smudges on her fingers and arms. Robert's attitude toward her painting had evolved from dismissive amusement to something approaching resentment. He complained about the smell of paint in the house, the way she had taken over the spare room with canvases and supplies, and most of all, the way she seemed distracted and distant during their conversations. "It's like living with a stranger," he told his brother during one of their weekly phone calls, not knowing that Sarah could hear him from the kitchen. "She's obsessed with this painting nonsense. I come home from work, and she barely looks up from whatever she's working on. It's not normal behavior for a woman her age." Her children weren't much better. Michael had started making jokes about Mom's midlife crisis whenever the topic of her art came up, and Jennifer had begun dropping not-so-subtle hints about how Sarah's new hobby was affecting her availability to help with the grandchildren. "I know. You're busy with your paintings," Jennifer would say when she needed a babysitter. "But some of us have real responsibilities that can't just be put aside for creative self-expression." Each comment felt like a small betrayal, but Sarah had learned to protect her newfound passion by sharing less and less about her progress with her family. The only person who truly understood what she was going through was David Chen, who had become both a mentor and a friend during this crucial period. He would stop by the gallery occasionally to check on the exhibition preparations, and he always made time to look at Sarah's latest work and offer encouragement and technical advice. "You're developing your own visual language," he told her one afternoon as they stood in front of her newest painting, an abstract representation of the emotions she experienced during particularly difficult days at the hospital. "Most artists take years to find their authentic voice, but you're painting with such honesty and vulnerability that your style is emerging naturally." 3 weeks before the exhibition opening, Maria Santos called with news that made Sarah's heart race with excitement and terror in equal measure. A prominent art collector from Aspen had seen preliminary photos of the exhibition pieces and was particularly interested in Sarah's portrait of the elderly patient. He wanted to know if there would be other similar works in the show, and whether Sarah might be interested in painting a commissioned portrait of his late mother based on a series of family photographs. The commission would pay $8,000, Maria explained, which is extraordinary for an emerging artist. But more importantly, this collector has connections throughout Colorado and beyond. If he becomes a patron of your work, it could open doors that usually take artists decades to walk through. That evening, Sarah sat in her studio, staring at the portrait that had somehow become the centerpiece of her artistic career. She had painted it from memory, capturing not just the physical features of Mrs. Henderson, an 87-year-old woman who had spent her final days in Sarah's care, but somehow also the wisdom, sadness, and quiet dignity that had made the elderly woman so memorable. Sarah remembered the conversations they'd had during long night shifts, how Mrs. Henderson had shared stories about her youth, her marriage, her children, and her regrets. "I always wanted to be a teacher," Mrs. Henderson had whispered one night, "but my parents said it wasn't practical for a girl from our neighborhood. I wonder sometimes what my life would have been like if I'd been brave enough to follow that dream." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she had painted her way to recognition by capturing the story of a woman who had given up her dreams for practicality. As she worked on 2 additional pieces for the exhibition, she found herself thinking constantly about Mrs. Henderson's words and wondering if she was finally being brave enough to follow her own dreams, despite the lack of support from the people who were supposed to love her most. The week before the exhibition opening, Sarah made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. She invited her entire family to the opening reception, knowing full well that they might attend only to prove that her success was temporary or accidental. Robert's response was predictably unenthusiastic. "I suppose we can stop by for a few minutes," he said, "but I'm not dressing up for some amateur art show in a part of town where parking costs more than most people make in a day." Jennifer was similarly lukewarm. "I'll try to come if I can find a babysitter," she promised, "but you know how hard it is to get out on weekend evenings." Michael at least seemed curious, though he framed his interest in typically practical terms. "I want to see what kind of prices they're asking for this stuff," he said. "It'll be interesting to understand the economics of the local art market." The night before the opening reception, Sarah stood in her studio surrounded by the paintings that would be displayed the following evening. She had created more work in the past 6 weeks than she would have thought possible, each piece better than the last, each one a step forward in her evolution as an artist. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, from those first tentative brushstrokes in the spare room to tomorrow night's professional exhibition. Regardless of what happened at the reception, regardless of whether her family ever truly understood or supported her artistic journey, she knew that she had already achieved something remarkable. She had found herself, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, and that discovery was worth more than any external validation could ever be. The evening of the gallery opening arrived with unseasonably warm weather and clear skies that felt like a blessing from the universe. Sarah had spent the morning at the gallery helping Maria Santos with the final preparations, watching as professional installers adjusted lighting and positioning to show each piece to its best advantage. Seeing her work displayed alongside 4 other emerging artists was both humbling and exhilarating. But what struck her most was how natural her paintings looked in this environment, as if they belonged there, as if she belonged there. Maria had arranged the exhibition thoughtfully, grouping complementary pieces and creating visual conversations between different artists' work. Sarah's portrait of Mrs. Henderson was positioned as one of the centerpiece works, illuminated by a spotlight that seemed to make the elderly woman's eyes come alive with wisdom and compassion. Standing before it in the empty gallery, Sarah felt a rush of emotion that brought tears to her eyes. She had captured something true and important in that painting, something that spoke to the universal human experience of aging, dignity, and the stories we carry within us. The first guests began arriving at 6 o'clock, and Sarah was amazed by the diversity of people who came through the gallery doors. There were established collectors in expensive suits, young art students with portfolio bags slung over their shoulders, families from the neighborhood who had wandered in out of curiosity, and seasoned artists who moved through the space with the confident eye of professionals evaluating new talent. Sarah had positioned herself near her paintings, but not too close, wanting to observe people's reactions without influencing their experience. At 7:30, her family finally arrived, looking somewhat uncomfortable in their dress clothes and clearly uncertain about how to behave in a gallery setting. Robert wore the same navy suit he'd worn to Jennifer's wedding 5 years earlier, and he kept tugging at his tie as if it were strangling him. Jennifer had managed to find a babysitter after all and looked elegant in a black dress Sarah had never seen before, but her eyes kept darting around the room as if she were searching for the exit. Michael arrived separately with his girlfriend Tracy, both of them appearing more interested in the wine and cheese than in the artwork. Sarah watched nervously as her family approached her paintings, uncertain about what their reactions would be and whether she was prepared to handle their criticism in such a public setting. But something unexpected happened as they stood before the portrait of Mrs. Henderson. Jennifer's expression softened, and she stepped closer to examine the brushwork and the emotional depth Sarah had achieved in the subject's eyes. "Mom," she said quietly, "this is incredible. I had no idea you could paint like this." Even Robert seemed moved by the piece, though he tried to hide his reaction behind his usual practical commentary. "Well, I suppose it looks like the person you were trying to paint," he admitted grudgingly. The real surprise came when Michael overheard a conversation between 2 collectors who were discussing Sarah's work. "The artist has an extraordinary ability to capture psychological depth," one of them was saying. "This portrait has the kind of emotional resonance you usually only see from artists with decades of experience. If this is truly her first exhibition, we're looking at someone with remarkable natural talent." Michael's expression shifted from skeptical amusement to something approaching respect, and Sarah saw him looking at her paintings with new eyes as if he were seeing them for the first time. The evening's pivotal moment came at 8:15, when the art collector from Aspen arrived with his wife and a small entourage of friends. Maria Santos introduced him to Sarah as James Morrison, and she immediately recognized his name from the plaques she'd seen in other galleries around the city. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that suggested both wealth and sophisticated taste. When Maria led him to Sarah's portrait, he stood silently for several minutes, studying every detail with the intensity of someone who understood both the technical and emotional aspects of fine art. "This is extraordinary work," he finally said, turning to Sarah with genuine admiration in his voice. "I've been collecting art for over 30 years, and I can tell you that this kind of emotional authenticity is incredibly rare, especially in emerging artists. You've captured something in this woman's eyes that speaks to the universal human experience of aging with dignity and grace. It's masterful." His words carried the weight of professional expertise, and Sarah felt a validation that went far beyond anything she had experienced before. The conversation that followed changed everything. James Morrison confirmed his interest in commissioning a portrait of his late mother, but he also introduced Sarah to several other collectors in his circle who were immediately drawn to her work. By the end of the evening, both of her pieces in the exhibition had sold. She had received 3 additional commission requests, and 2 other galleries in Denver had expressed interest in representing her work in future shows. As the reception wound down and the last guests filtered out into the warm evening air, Sarah found herself surrounded by her family, who seemed to be seeing her clearly for the first time in months. The skepticism and dismissive attitudes that had characterized their earlier responses had been replaced by something that looked like genuine pride and amazement. Jennifer hugged her tightly and whispered, "Mom, I owe you an apology. I had no idea how talented you are or how serious this could become." Even Robert seemed shaken by the evening's events, his usual practical commentary replaced by an almost stunned silence. "My dear friends, I want to pause here in Sarah's story because I know many of you watching right now have faced similar doubts from the people you love most. Sometimes the greatest obstacles to our dreams aren't external barriers, but the well-meaning skepticism of family members who think they're protecting us from disappointment. If you've ever felt discouraged by someone who didn't believe in your potential, please know that you're not alone in this community. Hit that subscribe button and join thousands of others who believe it's never too late to discover who you're meant to be. And please share in the comments below. What dream are you afraid to pursue because others have told you it's impractical? Your story might be the encouragement someone else needs to take their first brave step. We're building something beautiful together here, and your voice matters more than you know. The weeks following the gallery opening felt like living in an alternate reality for Sarah. The art world, which had seemed so mysterious and inaccessible just months before, suddenly opened its doors to welcome her as a legitimate member of the creative community. James Morrison's commission turned out to be even more significant than she had initially realized. Not only did he pay her $8,000 for the portrait of his late mother, but he also introduced her to his network of collectors throughout Colorado and beyond, each of whom seemed to understand immediately that they were witnessing the emergence of an exceptional talent. The portrait commission was both challenging and deeply rewarding. Working from a collection of family photographs, Sarah spent hours studying the face of Morrison's mother, a woman named Eleanor, who had been a pioneer in early childhood education in Colorado during the 1950s and 60s. As Sarah painted, she found herself drawing connections between Eleanor's story and her own late-in-life career change, understanding in a profound way how personal reinvention could happen at any stage of life. The finished portrait captured not only Eleanor's physical features, but also the strength and determination that had allowed her to challenge educational conventions and create lasting change in her field. When Sarah delivered the completed portrait to the Morrison home in Aspen, the reaction was everything she could have hoped for and more. James Morrison's wife, Catherine, broke down in tears when she saw the painting, explaining that Sarah had somehow captured aspects of Eleanor's personality that hadn't been visible in any of the reference photographs. "You've painted her soul," Catherine whispered, reaching out to touch the canvas gently. "This isn't just a likeness. This is Eleanor as we remember her, with all her wisdom and compassion and fierce determination to make the world better for children." The success of the Morrison portrait led to a cascade of opportunities that transformed Sarah's life in ways she never could have imagined. Word spread quickly through Colorado's art collecting community about the nurse-turned-artist who could capture the essence of a person's character with remarkable sensitivity and skill. Within 3 months of her first exhibition, Sarah had a waiting list of commission requests that extended well into the following year, and she was earning more from her art than she made in her nursing job at the hospital. The financial success was gratifying, but what moved Sarah most deeply was the emotional impact her work was having on the families who commissioned portraits. She painted elderly patriarchs and matriarchs whose children wanted to preserve their memory and wisdom for future generations. She created portraits of young people lost too soon, working with grieving parents who found comfort in seeing their children's spirits captured in oil and canvas. Each commission taught her something new about the power of art to heal, to preserve memory, and to celebrate the irreplaceable uniqueness of individual human lives. Her family's attitude toward her artistic career underwent a complete transformation during this period. Robert, who had been the most skeptical about her pursuits, found himself becoming her unofficial business manager, helping her organize commission schedules and manage the financial aspects of her growing success. "I may not understand art," he admitted one evening as they reviewed her commission calendar, "but I understand business. And what you're building here is impressive by any measure." Jennifer became her biggest supporter among their friends and neighbors, proudly showing photos of Sarah's paintings on her phone and bragging about her mother's artistic achievements to anyone who would listen. Michael's response was perhaps the most surprising of all. As someone who worked in finance and had always valued quantifiable success, he was amazed by the economic validation of his mother's talent. "Mom," he told her after she received her 5th commission request in a single week, "I've been wrong about everything. This isn't just a hobby or a midlife crisis. This is a legitimate business built on extraordinary talent. You're not just making money, you're making really good money doing something you love. That's the American dream right there." His newfound respect for her artistic career was both gratifying and slightly amusing to Sarah, who realized that her family needed external validation from the art world before they could fully appreciate what she was creating. The most meaningful moment in this period of transformation came when Sarah decided to make a formal change to her work schedule at the hospital. Rather than quitting outright, she negotiated a reduction to part-time hours, allowing her to maintain her connection to nursing while dedicating more time to her artistic career. The conversation with her supervisor was nerve-wracking, but it turned out that news of Sarah's artistic success had already spread throughout the hospital, and her colleagues were both impressed and supportive of her career transition. "Sarah," her supervisor said during their meeting, "in 20 years of managing nurses, I've never seen anyone discover a hidden talent like this at mid-career. What you're doing is inspiring to all of us who sometimes feel stuck in our routines. We'd rather have you part-time than lose you entirely, and honestly, I think your artistic work is making you an even better nurse. You're seeing patients with different eyes now, understanding their stories in a deeper way." The truth of those words resonated deeply with Sarah. Her artistic practice had indeed changed how she approached her nursing responsibilities, making her more attentive to the individual humanity of each patient, more sensitive to the stories written in their faces, more aware of the dignity and complexity that every person carried with them, regardless of their circumstances. Her art was making her a better nurse, and her nursing experience was making her a better artist, creating a synergy between her two callings that felt both natural and profound. As she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point, Sarah realized that the dismissive comments and lack of support from her family had actually served an important purpose in her development. Their skepticism had forced her to develop internal validation and self-confidence, to trust her own artistic instincts rather than relying on external approval. In a strange way, their initial lack of faith had made her stronger and more determined, proving to herself that she could succeed based on her own merit and perseverance rather than on the encouragement of others. One year after her first gallery exhibition, Sarah Martinez stood in the main space of the Denver Art Museum, surrounded by 35 of her finest paintings in what had become the most talked-about solo exhibition in the city's recent memory. The show, titled Portraits of Grace, The Hidden Stories We Carry, featured not only her commissioned portraits, but also an intimate series of self-portraits documenting her journey from the dark days when her own family rejected her for pursuing her artistic dream. Every brushstroke on these canvases carried the weight of years of doubt, loneliness, and unwavering determination that had brought her to this extraordinary moment. The main gallery vibrated with palpable energy as collectors, art critics, and enthusiasts circulated among the works, their voices creating a low, reverent murmur that echoed off the pristine white walls. Sarah watched discreetly from a corner, still unable to fully believe this was her moment, her silent victory over all those who said she was wasting her life pursuing something as impractical as art. Her hands, permanently stained with paints from decades of dedicated work, trembled slightly as she held a glass of wine she had barely touched, her eyes scanning each work as if seeing them for the first time. "Sarah, you need to see this," whispered Marcus Chen, her gallerist, approaching her with a smile she had never seen on his normally composed face. He held a small red sticker, the universal symbol of a sold work, and was heading directly toward her centerpiece, a monumentally sized self-portrait titled "Breaking the Silence." The painting showed Sarah in 3 phases of her life: a small child painting joyfully, a young adult crying over a rejected canvas, and finally herself today, raising a paintbrush like a victorious sword against a radiant golden background, suggesting rebirth and triumph. $500,000, Marcus murmured in her ear, his voice laden with disbelief and pride. A private collector from New York. He said he'd never seen such a powerful representation of the artistic journey, of the struggle against family and social adversity. Said the work speaks directly to his own experience of being misunderstood for following his dreams. Sarah felt her legs weaken, the world spinning around her as she processed the words. $500,000 for a single painting. More money than her family had ever imagined anyone could earn from scribbles on canvas, as her father used to disparagingly call her work. Sarah's thoughts flew back to that terrible night 3 years ago when she announced to her family during Thanksgiving dinner that she was leaving her well-paid corporate job to dedicate herself fully to painting. The table fell into a deathly silence, only the sound of silverware touching plates echoing in the tense air. Her father, a stern man who had built a prosperous construction company with his own hands, was the first to explode. "Sarah, you're 30 years old. When are you going to stop playing around and take on real responsibilities? Art doesn't pay the bills, doesn't build a future. You're wasting your education, wasting the money we spent to get you through college." Her mother, always trying to keep the peace, whispered concerns about financial security and stability, while her siblings exchanged embarrassed looks and shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "You don't understand," Sarah had replied, her voice trembling but determined. "I need to do this. I have stories to tell, emotions to express that I can only put on canvas. I can't keep living a life that isn't mine just because it's safer." But her words fell on deaf ears. That night, she left her childhood, home feeling lonelier than she had ever felt, carrying only her determination and a suitcase full of art supplies she had secretly saved for years. The following months were brutal. Sarah moved to a small apartment in the Denver suburbs, transforming what should have been her living room into a makeshift studio. She worked part-time as a waitress to pay basic bills while dedicating every free minute to painting, often working until dawn under cheap artificial light that distorted colors and strained her eyes. Her savings dwindled rapidly, and several times she considered giving up, especially when she called home and heard the poorly disguised disappointment in her parents' voices, their subtle questions about when she would return to reality, piercing her heart like needles. But something extraordinary began to happen in her art during these months of isolation and struggle. Her paintings acquired an emotional depth she had never achieved before, each work charged with the pain of family rejection, the loneliness of pursuing a misunderstood dream, but also with a fierce determination that shone through every applied color. She painted portraits of other misunderstood dreamers she knew: the street musician who played melancholic jazz on corners, the elderly dancer who still practiced ballet in her small studio, the poet who worked as a taxi driver at night to support his passion for words. The first sale came unexpectedly, through Marcus, who discovered her work at a small group exhibition in a local coffee shop. He saw something special in her paintings, an emotional honesty and technical skill that impressed him immediately. "You have a rare gift," he said at that first meeting, studying her works with a connoisseur's eyes. "You paint not just what you see, but what you feel. That's true art." Under his guidance, Sarah began receiving portrait commissions, each client drawn to her unique ability to capture not just the physical appearance, but the emotional essence of her subjects. Now, standing in this prestigious gallery, surrounded by admirers and celebrating the $500,000 sale, Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her achievement. She had proven not just to her family, but to herself, that following her dreams wasn't a waste, it was courage. She picked up her phone and, for the first time in months, dialed home, ready to share her victory and, perhaps, begin to heal the wounds that distance and misunderstanding had created.